Glad to have everybody with us today. My name is Alan Hick, and I'm the director of the Weiser Center for Emerging Democracies. We are pleased to have with us today Elizabeth Kakness, who's been one of our Weiser postdoctoral fellows this year. Elizabeth works on the political and social effects of development policy in middle-income countries, and she's particularly interested in a lot of work in Brazil. She's working on a book entitled Politics, Poverty, and the Policy in Brazil, and she'll be presenting some of that work with us today. She did a BA International Affairs in Spanish from the University of Mary Washington, and got her PhD from the University of Virginia last year. Delighted to have her with us, and please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Thank you. Before I get started talking about politics, poverty, and policy in Brazil, I'd like to just say that this talk is geared towards a general audience, but if anybody has any technical questions about the statistics or estimation strategy, et cetera, I'd be happy to answer that in the Q&A. So the topics that I'm going to discuss today involve two major spheres. One is, of course, development policy, and then the other is the ramifications for the politics of developing countries. So on the one hand, we have questions like what programs advance health, well-being, and reduce inequality, and how do they do that? And on the other, what type of effects do these programs have on the consolidation of emerging democracies in middle-income countries? And we're going to use the case of Brazil today to explore these questions. Illustratively, we have here the erstwhile president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, giving a speech announcing a major campaign that she initiated before the 2014 elections called Brasil Sem Miséria, which is a program, it's actually a constellation of programs encompassing the one that we'll be talking about today. But I wanted to highlight the role that this type of policy has played in electoral campaigns and in governance in major middle-income countries like Brazil. And then I want to call to attention my little friend, Neto, who in this picture is about 4 years old. He lives in the countryside in one of the survey sites that I was working in Brazil. And he wanted to show me his house here, which is essentially, as you can see, sort of a concrete slab with a really roughly formed house, no windows, no doors, tarps to cover, right? And he and his family are beneficiaries of this program. So I'll use him as an example going forward about the effects that this program can have on a Brazilian family, right? So the programs that I'm going to be talking about today are some of the most innovative programs ever to address the issues of systemic inequalities and development in the developing world, but they have one of the least innovative titles, right? They are exactly what they say they are. They are conditional cash transfer programs, which means they transfer cash with the aim of ending immediate poverty directly to the female head of household from an insulated bureaucracy at the federal level, right? There's some partnership at the municipal level to make sure that everybody residing in that town that meets the means test is covered. But these are programs that transfer cash to end the immediate situation of poverty in a household, but with strings attached, right? With conditions, right? The conditions are aimed at ending intergenerational poverty, right? So that Neto's situation is different than that of his parents or grandparents, and his life outcomes are measurably different. And so they focus on behaviors such as taking kids to school, taking them to the doctor, making sure that children receive a schedule of vaccines, pre- and postnatal care, et cetera, right? So they focus on children's health and human capital. And Nancy Birdsall, an esteemed economist in Washington, D.C., has called these publicly on multiple occasions the silver bullet, right? The best we can get in the war against poverty in the developing world. And so just to give a few statistics about how these have worked in Brazil, from their initiation in 2003 up to a decade later, the poverty rate was cut in half, right? And that's using the most conservative measure of poverty thresholds. If we look at perhaps $2 a day or other commonly used statistics, this would be even higher. There are substantial reductions in childhood mortality, not only across the board for all families, but those families that invest in potable water systems or in caloric diversity, things like having more fruits and vegetables, or importantly, as Brazilians would say, the Sunday barbecue and having enough money to have a little extra meat, to have this very important cultural ritual in Brazil, the Sunday afternoon churrasco. We see children's mortality rates decline by 50% for those who are no longer plagued by issues like diarrhea, simply, right? Of course, because it's part of the conditions and behaviors attached to the program itself, increases in school enrollment and promotion, right? Students are going to school and they are getting good grades. And interestingly, because people like Luisa, Netu's mother, have a few extra reais, a little extra cash at the end of the month, they can save that money and buy extra goods for the house they otherwise would not be unable to buy, right? So things like a water filter or the sort of makeshift washing machine apparatus that saves time and is more cleanly for women to do washing and things like that that take away some of the burdens of the household and allow her to do some more work. We see in favelas and other poor areas of Brazil increases in entrepreneurship, right? So small shops pop up, or even big box stores like the Target of Brazil, Casas Bahia, allows payment plans so that people can set aside 10 extra reais per month to buy something like an iron or new shoes or a cell phone, which increases communications and access to information, right? So we see quite a few downstream effects to these programs beyond the major ones that are tied in directly to the stipulations of the program. Right, so when we think about the impact of these programs, we can really think of 3 different pillars of development, right? We've got social, political, and economic ramifications. So we've mentioned that access to education is increased, access to healthcare is increased, because women are the primary beneficiaries or recipients of the program who then, work with their children within the guidelines of the program. There's increased gender equality within a household, as well as work in the Andes, and some of my other work in Brazil shows that there's greater racial and ethnic equality. Once these programs are designed along a means test, it kind of helps to ameliorate certain structural inequalities present in these societies. Today, the focus will, of course, as a political scientist, will be talking about the political ramifications of these programs. And so I'll present some evidence that these programs help to consolidate weak institutions. Other work has shown that these programs ameliorate problems with vote buying and other elements of corruption. And I'll show you the degree to which these programs help to get people interested in the political process. Of course, we're transferring cash, so we're ameliorating poverty and inequality. Because women have extra time because of the different resources that are available to them, there's more increase in the labor force, as well as educated children who are healthy and survive past age 5. So the future labor force is also stronger and healthier. And because we're focusing on health and education, we see the increase in schools and clinics. So we see an increase in infrastructure as well. So these are very popular programs, right? They start in the late 90s in Mexico and Brazil, and a small pilot program in Bangladesh. And to give only a comparison of the first 10 years, they've proliferated around the globe. To this day, you see more in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa than are represented in 2008. But all of the programs in Latin America appeared in the first 10 years of the existence of these programs and exist to this day, including one in Uruguay. So the Bolsa Familia program is the Brazilian conditional cash transfer program. And so a few details about the program before we get into the study. So it was nationalized in 2003 under Lula da Silva of the center-left Workers' Party. It had pilot instances in earlier administrations, but it was rebranded and nationalized by Lula da Silva, right? Today, it benefits 13 million families, or 50 million people, roughly, which to put in context is about a quarter of the Brazilian population of about 200 million people. So it's quite a lot of people supported by this program. The benefit is about 77 reais per month, although benefits do shift based on the age and number of children in the household. And put that in context, 77 reais is about $20 a month, right? But this can double the income of a family that receives the program. Importantly, and this seems like a boring statistic, but is actually, compared to other attempts to ameliorate poverty in Brazil and countries like it, 96% of the transfers go to the poorest two quintiles of the income distribution, which means that the money is going to the people who need it and not political cronies and not partisans or other people who might otherwise receive the money. And 70% of transfers go to the northeast of the country. Right? The northeast of Brazil is the least developed area of the country, and we'll see that here. Right? So these are just two maps, again, just a decade comparison before and after the nationalization of this program. Right? So in 1991, Brazil is coming out of the debt crisis of the 1980s. It's still very early in its most recent democratic period. And these are maps of the Municipal Human Development Index, which is the score that the UNDP uses to understand the quality of life in a particular area. So red is least developed, and the closer you get to blue, the more developed you are, right? So yellow and green are sort of intermediaries on that scale. Right? So in 1991, Brazil was pretty uniformly underdeveloped, right? But by 2010, and of course this is not taking into account many other things that are happening in this time period, but in some part because of the Bolsa Familia, we see that the Northeast remains on the redder side of the scale, and the Southeast becomes much more developed. And this maps perfectly into maps of a fundamental political realignment. Right? So in those elections, right at the beginning of the idea of these programs, you see that Fernando Henrique Cardoso wins the 1998 presidential election almost unanimously, right? So there's a local boss who wins the state of Ceará, and Lula da Silva only wins 2 states, right? Fast forward to the election after the nationalization of this program, and we start to see a very important regional shift. These areas that receive 70% of the transfers go red, right? In Brazil, red is left and blue is right, so you just kind of turn around your American orientation there. And so we see here more developed states vote for the center-right party and less developed states vote for Lula da Silva. There's a backstory here that this is in fact opposite to the way that the red party, the PT, developed, which I can talk about in Q&A. And this realignment has sort of calcified, right? So we see still in the 2010 election, Lula's successor, Dilma Rousseff, continues this pattern, and again, it continued in the 2014 election. Right? So why study Brazil? Why study these programs in Brazil? Well, from the political side, Brazil is a classic case of weak political institutions. Famously, in one of the most important studies of political party systems in Latin America, Brazilian parties were considered feckless, which is, just to note, one of my favorite words to describe something. If you really want to call something bad, you call it feckless, right? They were absolutely inept. Parties had no cohesion amongst themselves in legislatures and no linkages with voters vertically, right? The people didn't vote for parties, right? This is partially because of the electoral system in Brazil, which rewards candidates for kind of going it alone, although sort of paradoxically makes parties align themselves, makes candidates align with the party to get on a ballot. So we see a lot of vote buying and other types of corruption schemes to finance elections, which unfortunately continues to this day if anyone's following the news in Brazil. And so on from the voter side, we see a lot of split ticket voting, right? So voters might vote for one candidate or party for president and a different for the legislature and another for a local office, et cetera, right? So there's no cohesion in the way that people vote either, right? And partially that's because there's low voter interest in Brazil pretty uniformly across different ways that you could cut up the populace. Yet, of course, in Brazil, it's this mandatory voting system. So you've sort of got this democracy by obligation in Brazil, and yet no cohesion in the system in the way that we think of institutions. And then from the policy side, we've got as we've seen, extreme economic inequality and unequal access to both government and private resources in housing, education, and healthcare, right? Which leads us to pictures like this, which I took in Recife of two young girls collecting recyclables as a means of income, right? So we've got quite low social mobility, right? So to the extent that a program designed to ameliorate these types of policy issues affects these kind of systematic pathologies of democracy, we could see that there might be some power of policy to strengthen the politics, right? Which is sort of different than the way that we conceive of policies working. So, of course, I'm not the only scholar to be looking at these programs. And there are sort of three broad categories of theories, right? So a lot of literature, particularly early literature on the electoral effects of conditional cash transfer programs, looks at it through the lens of retrospective voting, which essentially suggests that a voter enters the ballot box and says, am I better off or not than I was 4 years ago or under the prior administration? If I am better off, perhaps I'll vote for the incumbent. If I'm not, then I won't, right? So the implication for our questions here about the electoral effects of CCTs is to say that presidents might experience a boost, right? That beneficiaries might support an incumbent president because they feel better off, right? Not because of some kind of ideological or partisan reason. Another area of literature suggests that when parties promulgate such policy, it connects them ideologically with the group of voters most affected by that program, right? So policy might generate linkages between the party and the voters, but not specifically beneficiaries. Perhaps people on the other side of the means test for whom this policy suggests that finally politicians are paying attention to poor people. Maybe not as poor as the recipients of the program, but poor people generally. And for that reason, I might be ideologically linked to that party, right? So there's two competing examples. But then I want to consider the context of Brazil, the context of Luisa and Osvaldo, Neto's parents, right? Luisa doesn't work, and she had Neto when she was 17 years old. She has no formal schooling, and she lives in the countryside. Osvaldo is a day laborer on a large agro-business farm, and of course doesn't have a lot of time to read the newspaper, even though he did receive about 6 years of formal schooling. So we really need to take into account, for either of these to be right, we need to make sure that voters are actually acknowledging a particular party or candidate as somebody that supports or provides the program, right? For any of this to make sense, this is sort of the micro foundation of that, right? So for a linkage to form, as it would in this second idea, we need to make sure that people are giving credit where credit is due, right? And because we're considering people with what we consider low democratic capabilities, this is going to be strongest for people who have experience with this program, who understand its effects. Right? So this is a little schmaltzy, but I am a visual person, so I hope that you will take this in stride with me. Right? So we can kind of think about these theories as sort of representing the Brazilian flag. Right? So in the first idea, it doesn't matter. There's no formulation theoretically of credit. It might be implicit, but it's not a stipulation of that theory. So really just beneficiaries vote for the incumbent program. And that's really a broad idea. So we'll call that green, right? But party system institutionalization, this idea that programmatic policies link voters based on a sort of a class distribution, makes very clear the idea of crediting a party, but doesn't have much to say about beneficiary status, right? So we can kind of call that edging in a little bit on this idea. And then my theory here is sort of the bullseye. Perhaps that's a little bold, but let's just go with it, right? So that would be in this box, right? Beneficiaries who credit the PT. That's where we're going to see a lot of the positive action in the voting data. Right? So unlike a lot of other work that studies CCTs based on municipal level transfers and municipal level voting returns, really doesn't get into the minds of the voters themselves or the beneficiaries themselves, I ran a survey. Right? I asked people two very simple questions and about 6 other pages of questions, but 2 key ones, right? Who did you vote for, and who's responsible for providing the Bolsa Familia, right? But there's a problem, because when you run a survey in a developing country, you run into a situation sort of like this, right? A traditional sampling design might suggest that you run by zip codes, select a zip code, and just ask the people in that zip code conforming to a certain protocol, right? However, in this case, I would get people who are very unlikely to receive the Bolsa Familia, probably in the top quintile, and then I would really be interested in only interviewing people here, right? I want to interview people who receive the Bolsa Familia and people like them who don't, right? To really understand the effect of this program on politics. So I could not use any survey sampling method on the books. Instead, taking a cue from the innovative idea, yet sort of lackluster title, I've titled my sampling design purposive random sampling because it is exactly that. It samples with both purposive and random elements. And it does it like this. I selected municipalities based on a few key criteria, which I can go into in Q&A. And then I got the records of all of the Bolsa Familia respondents, or I'm sorry, Bolsa Familia recipients in those cities. Right? In some cases, this was hundreds of thousands of addresses. Right? And I stratified them by neighborhood. Right? So I found the neighborhoods that had the most addresses that received the Bolsa Familia. And I randomly selected among them. Then I looked at each randomly selected neighborhood and found the streets with the largest number of houses on that street that received the Bolsa Familia, and those are my high-impact streets that are the most like this, right? And then I randomly selected the start locations for my enumerators based on those randomly selected streets. And then, because in Brazil, if you were interviewing on a weekend, you'd probably get a grandmother or a mother answering the door and not a father or uncle or somebody else living in the household, right? And we would want parity in genders in the sample. I trained my enumerators to use the first birthday method, which we can treat as a random way of picking out who will respond to the survey within each household. So I did this survey in 2 states, right? Minas Gerais, this one that looks like Big Bird, and then this state here, Pernambuco. Within these 2 states, I performed the survey in Uberlândia, Minas Gerais, which is this is where Neto is from. It's partially industrial, partially rural city, and it's the city that most closely represents national electoral results within the municipality. So the electoral returns from Uberlândia are within 1% of the national electoral results. Right? So it's a really good weather bell for what's happening in the rest of the country. Right? And then I performed the survey in Recife, Pernambuco, which is a major city in the northeast. Actually quite a hard case to understand the role of the PT. And just by way of example, Recife, though larger than Uberlândia, controlling for population has 10 times as many beneficiaries as Uberlândia. So I will spare the audience actual numbers, but I'll just go back to the colors of the flag, right? So remember in that first theory, we're thinking about the way that beneficiaries vote relative to their neighbors. Do they vote for the PT more? Yes, they do, right? So if you statistically analyze the data and look only at whether or not you receive the Bolsa Familia, we see that beneficiaries vote for the president more than non-beneficiaries. But what happens when we incorporate program responsibility? Well, the effect of only receiving the program goes away. Right? So anyone who credits the PT is more likely to support the PT than people who don't credit the PT for that program, regardless of their beneficiary status. And this result holds for a lot of different offices. Right? So in the 2014 election, there was president, senator, state senator, governor, and one more that I can't remember right now. And so we see that these results hold further down the ticket, but not all the way. when we look at the joint effect of receiving the program and crediting the PT, we see that the effect is strongest for beneficiaries who credit the PT, right? And the causality of this is confirmed in robustness checks, which I can talk about in Q&A, right? So just to think about this a little bit substantively, right? We see that when we look at party identification, whether or not you affiliate with the PT, you sympathize with the PT, you see on the left here are non-beneficiaries, on the right are beneficiaries, and right, so red PT, blue not PT, right, so crediting. I see that there's a statistically significant difference amongst beneficiaries who credit and don't, and really not much going on for those who don't receive the program, right? And so then, of course, this magnitude is much higher for presidents. That's typical, even in advanced democracies. People know who the president is more than others, right? So this is a very popular electoral contest. You see there's quite a bit of difference here between beneficiaries who credit and don't the PT, right? But what's really particularly interesting for me is that these results and this pattern holds largely across all of the elected offices in the 2014 election, right? So for senator and for governor, again, we see a similar pattern, right? And now the magnitude here is a little bit smaller. This is partially because of Brazil's ballot structure and electoral laws, which allow for a couple of reasons literally hundreds of candidates to run for any open seat at these levels for state and federal deputy. We see that beneficiaries who credit the PT are likely to, at low, but are likely to name the PT as who they're going to vote for, right? On an open-ended survey question. This is important because this survey was taken well in advance of the campaign period, right, which is 6 weeks before the election. So the survey wrapped up in August, and the elections were in October, right? So for people with low democratic capabilities to know who they're going to vote for this far in advance is actually quite interesting, right? So what can we say? Policy certainly impacts politics in some way, right? And so I want to say thank you, and I'm Obrigada, and I'm welcoming your questions, and so is Neto, who is now 7 years old and ready to go to school, which just started in Brazil a couple weeks ago. Thanks. Really short. Yeah, I can field. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was really great. I have a question about about some of the questions you asked. I wanted to know if you were like controlling, or if you knew, like in both Minas Gerais and and Pernambuco, if you knew like the whether the party affiliation of the governor, the legislature composition by party, just to see, and if you could see. If that had any effect on whether they attributed the Bolsa Familia to PT or the other parties.
So I didn't ask on my survey those questions, but of course I have that information. And in other papers, there's hierarchical ways of treating who's in power and how that affects how people vote. That's not incorporated in this model, outside of the fact that there's a dummy variable for survey site, which, because it's not incorporated in other ways, would it partially ameliorate that. But yes, that's very important.
Okay. And then if I can do a
Sure,
quick
please,
second question. Were you able to collect data on who they voted for prior to the Bolsa Familia implementation?
Yes and no, right? So not prior to the Bolsa Familia implementation, because in many cases, those people weren't old enough to vote then. So this is 2014, and the implementation would have been 14 years ago at this point, and so a lot of the people affected were kids. The mean age in the sample is about 40, but that, of course, is extreme values. So I do ask who they voted for in 2010, And to the extent that voter recall data is reliable, there is people who vote PT in this election are voting in the last election the same way. But of course, people also tend to report that they voted for the person that won. So there's only so much you can do with that type of data. But yes, thank you. Walter, get my pen.
So generally, a common explanation for political activity is social involvement in either call them community organizations, or they could be workplace organizations if there's that kind of workplace that extends over, or even political organizations, parties, and things like that. But especially here with apparently marginally educated and literate folks, it seems pretty compelling that the folks who assigned credit but had no education didn't get that from reading anything. And so do you have any information about whether the people who assigned credit were more or less participant in social organizations, or more or less likely to be politically active, or any sign like that to tell you, where the information came from in this context of presumably low literacy?
Yes, I do. So I ask a series of standard questions about whether and how often they go to meetings of a neighborhood association, church meetings, parent-teacher organizations, et cetera, right? There's a list of 5 or 6 of them. And activism actually, so in another paper that I have in this project, I look more specifically at the role of activism and how Bolsa Familia recipients are different or not than their neighbors in that capacity. But it's not really affecting attribution. That's one of my, so I tried to instrument on that, and it was not. How does that work? They can't read it. Well, I think it has to do with receiving the program, right? That when you receive the program, you, in some cases, it's the first formal identity card that people who receive it have ever gotten, right? So there's the process of signing up for and carrying out the conditions that alerts one to these things. I don't think it's a situation of clientelism where somebody's saying, remember that the PT gave this to you, right? Because this is happening in places that are PT controlled and not PT controlled, right? But it's sort of an open question, right? So in my pretest, when I looked at various standard measures of political sophistication to try and draw some variance, I see who's attributing and who's not, and why, I don't get any really interesting results. And in fact, the results were so across the board that I cut it from the survey to lessen both interviewer and interviewer and interviewee fatigue. But yeah, it's sort of open. It's the next project.
So 2 quick questions. Can you say a bit more about the shift in PT support, and particularly why PT loses support in its stronghold in the South? I was interested in your thoughts on that. And the second question about your sampling strategy. Given that the program's been really good at targeting those, targeting people based on systematic and objective criteria, how different are your recipients and non-recipients? Are they different in fundamental important ways in terms of income or backgrounds or other things? And if they are, how are you controlling for those to make sure that what's happening is what you think is happening?
Yes. So shift in the PT from the South. So the PT begins in the late 70s and early 80s amongst heavy industry labor union members in the area around Sao Paulo for the most part. And it that remains its center of strength throughout all of Lula's electoral bids until the rise in the popularity of the Bolsa Familia. So there are a couple different explanations for how this shift has happened. Partially, it's a tactical shift on the part of higher-up party members to increase or decrease the vulnerability, we'll say, of the PT, which failed because they didn't realize the overwhelming power of the legislature. And in another way, it has to do with the politics of redistribution, I think. So in my interviews in the Southeast with organizers, higher-ups in the labor unions, there's sort of this bifurcation where they really want to support the PT And yet the PT's policies have drifted away from the core set of policies targeted particularly at labor unions, right? And we'll call them formalized poor or lower middle class workers, right? And so the shift in attention to Brasil sem miséria, which is the picture of Dilma at the beginning, has kind of created a fissure there as well. Though I would say probably more political expediency than anything else. And sampling strategy. In the backup slides. Okay. So, so the balanced statistics, right? So this is the standardized differences of the unmatched sample, right? So the only things that are out of line, so this is age, education, gender, black, white, and part is mixed race, right? This is my index of income based on principal components analysis, and gender, right? And so the ones that fall outside the range, are still not egregiously outside, are gender, income, and age, which are directly related to the purpose of the program, right? So younger women who are slightly below the threshold are the ones who are going to be receiving the program, right? So I do match using SECON's genetic matching program, and then that it essentially drops to 0.
So this is a follow-up on the other question. So do you have enough data to test whether there's any kind of geographic concentration? Because I'm really puzzled by the presumably illiterate people who have all this political sophistication. So do they get it from their neighbors? Can you tell whether people tend to be in clusters? Because by default, the analysis would treat all the survey responses independent. And I was wondering if there's something about communities that you're not capturing with the measures you tried to have with your survey that might explain that people are in a, so to speak, local culture where they attribute to the parties the way they do or so forth. And I promise I'm going to.
No, I actually was looking forward to your questions. So I have 760 total observations, 360 in Uberlândia and 400 in Recife. And I have the street, address, and neighborhood of each one, right? So I have not run this test, but I could look at each neighborhood and see how many attributors there are per neighborhood, right? For another paper in this, I looked at the marginal difference in income per neighborhood as a way of understanding if there were spillovers for different situations. But yes, I could look at that. That was the end of the question? Okay. Yeah. In a good way, though, right?
What efforts is the party trying to make credit credit? They could put their name or the official or something on the side of the card.
Well, it's certainly the Bolsa Familia takes on a very interesting campaign presence, right? So not only did the PT just nationally in debates, in public advertising, just not targeted at a recipient, but generally brand themselves as the party of Bolsa Familia, but the major challenger of the Blue Party who during the campaign as a senator, tries to make the Bolsa Familia part of the Constitution. Brazil's Constitution is like 700 pages long, and anything that's in the Constitution is very hard to take out, right? So right now it's in this sort of social provision law, and it could be part of the Constitution, and this on the part of this other party to take some credit away from the PT for this program because they see the results that it's getting, right? And then a third candidate in the first round of the presidential election, who was a PT in Lula's first cabinet and then went off to start the Green Party, tried to instantiate the 13th Bolsa Familia, right? So you get a monthly transfer, but then at Christmas time you should get one more, right? So that you can have gifts for your kids or a nice Christmas dinner, and that's sort of something that formal workers would get, so why not Bolsa Familia recipients as well, right? Again, to try and take away some of the popularity of the Bolsa Familia from the PT and to her and the Green Party, Marina Silva. So the debate is called the paternity of the PT, of the Bolsa Familia. And in Brazil, this is quite a lively debate, although it's pretty, the PT is sort of one, although there are the occasional op-eds from candidates and members of the Blue Party, the PSDB, to say, well, actually, it was under Cardoso that this started, that type of thing. So there is quite a bit of difference there. Yeah, Joe.
Yeah. So my question is also kind of related to attribution and credit claiming. So you had various charts showing the differences in like propensities to vote for the main party, and you had it broken up by the various races. Races in the sense of like a political
yes,
office. Yeah. I was curious if you had looked at any like differences just based on the electoral rules of the various races, right? Because we can think about, because some of them are single-member districts, right?
And the
like
rest are
the
all
Senate
PR.
and stuff. Yeah. So we know, like other research shows us that in those sorts of races, there's kind of the credit claiming takes shape differently than under races under proportional representation. Because if you're trying to pitch yourself to a local audience, you're much more likely to kind of harp on these sorts of things that benefited, like specifically if they benefited your community more than others. So I'd be interested to see whether you saw any sort of significant differences between kind of race to race, even in the same election, if that makes sense.
What type of difference?
Like in terms of, so with the people in the single member district, they're going to be just campaigning there, whereas for the legislature, there's no local politician to go to because it's proportional representation, like at the national level, right? And so potentially, right, it'd be interesting to see if, because again, for some of them, like particularly for the Senate, there was a much bigger difference. Like basically, it looked different in terms of the difference between people that didn't attribute in terms of their initial propensity to vote. So I was wondering if it might have been influenced by the electoral rules in this way.
Well, there are a lot of ways that electoral rules would affect a voter's decision in this context, right? In the context of low capabilities and credit, right? So on the one hand, there are way more candidates in the proportional, and there's more candidates from the same party, right? So this is propensity to vote PT. So I coded all of the different candidates as PT, right? So there's something there. And then I haven't looked into the electoral campaigns. Like I haven't covered that in this paper, like how the senator candidates, the candidates for senator campaigned or not on Bolsa Familia. What I'm really looking at is, are we seeing sort of a straight ticket emerging from people who attribute the program and receive it? So, but that's there. Yes, there are different ways to both use the party brand and to use Bolsa Familia to their advantage. That's a good point, Kristen.
I was wondering, this is like more simple, I guess, based on how recipient was identified. Like, so because it was interesting, like, I don't know, sociologically, to see how the female head of household was the one that was receiving the transfer. And so I don't know if you had to make any extra justification or like effort to extend the identity of recipient to both men and women. And I mean, that would just be more qualitatively, I guess, looking, and also the distribution within the household unit. I'm sure that, because there's like tons of studies on Bolsa Familia, and I know that's not what you're focusing on, but I don't know if you what your sort of justifications were for like sort of smoothing through that identity of being a recipient.
So the recipients are based on the household, if somebody in the household is a recipient or not. So it doesn't mean that the person who's answering my survey does or doesn't have a card in their name for the Bolsa, right? It's somebody in the household receives this benefit. Usually you're dealing with nuclear families or grandparents or an uncle or something living in the house as well. So there was, it's not sort of an informal community of tons of people living together, some of whom receive and don't, right? So that sort of takes care of that question, I think. Yes? Okay. Bruno?
First of all, it's really nice to hear from you as a Brazilian, and I'm from Pernambuco as well, so I know all this reality, I can say. But it's nice to hear from you, and it's nice to know that you have this topic as your object of study. Just one thing, I would say that the main political battle in Brazil today is to know who is the real father of Bolsa Familia, who is the party, who's the creator Yeah. So the problem, as you said, began, Bolsa Familia itself began in 2003, but it was like a consolidation of programs that we had before, like 10 years before, since 1995. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Well, yes,
Yeah,
you're right.
Fernando Henrique Cardoso, our former president, created, I think, in 1994 or 1995.
95 is Pepsi.
Yeah. And I would like to know if, in your questions to the recipients, what was like the margin of the people, what was the rate of the people that told that, okay, PT is the creator? Do you have like this statistic?
I have, this is attributes or don't, right? So you see there's variation across the categories, which is important for the analysis. And then,
You can go back to that.
oh,
Attribute correctly or
yes, attribute correctly to the PT.
correctly means PT.
Attributes to the PT. About 12% of the sample attribute the Bolsa Familia to Cardoso. This is raw, yeah.
Okay. And just another comment. I don't know if you, in your study, you don't tackle that. Of course, it's not the part of your study, but two things actually. In the last 3 years, our economic growth really collapsed, and if you look to the statistics of the rate of people who are in support of Dilma herself, like 2 years ago, when the economics started to collapse, I don't know if there's the same pattern of people like who supported her because she was the mother of Bolsa Familia, as people say in Brazil, and if the same people would be like not supporting her 3 years ago because her economical policy was like putting our economy down and things like that. I don't know if you can like link this because it would be another way to show that the Bolsa Familia is really linked to the Workers' Party.
Okay, so let me just say that I have another survey in the field right now, or actually just coming out of the field, looking at some of these issues within Mare and other communities in Rio. And the popularity of the PT as it declines pretty much in lockstep with the economic bust, right? The end of this commodities boom that Lula basically rode for 10 years. Doesn't necessarily only affect Bolsa Familia recipients, right? So people who are middle class who vote for the PT, perhaps for retrospective reasons, because they are doing better, right? There are, other programs like wider access to credit and other sort of non-affiliated programs that the PT enables that kind of grow middle class support. And that it doesn't matter if you have access to credit if there's no money and no job, right? So those types of things kind of go away. But I don't know, because I ran the survey. I was in Brazil when the crisis started, but I was not there when it got really bad. Although my dollars would have gone so much farther, so I could have done a different survey. But I don't know whether or not this is happening amongst Bolsa Familia recipients as well, right? The same punishment of the PT for macroeconomic reasons.
Just my last comment.
Okay.
PT, during his lifetime, I would say, had a huge work trying to link itself to the Bolsa Familia as the father of Bolsa Familia.
Yeah.
And during national campaigns, the party was like trying to tell the people that if another party would win the elections, they would terminate the program.
Right.
And I don't know if you asked the recipients if they were afraid of this termination of the program if the other party wins the election.
I did ask that, and I didn't find any really significant results.
Okay.
I only asked the recipients, though, and as you can see, the beneficiaries are only 389 of my, so 51%. And amongst that 51%, that was not a fear.
Okay.
Right? But it is, so there are other national surveys that ask this question, and even if you look just at the national populace, this is a suspicion, right? Which is curious because of your discussion of the paternity of the Bolsa Familia, which of course, the idea of transferring cash to poor people existed in the 90s, right? And they did this under Cardoso, who was president for 2 terms in the 90s, by trying to eliminate child working, a food subsidy, a gas subsidy, and a school subsidy, all of which were really small and never reached full nationalization, right? So they started out, when you're talking about these programs, they're in 2 cities, the capital and Campinas in São Paulo.
Yeah,
And so they're like, but even though the role of this other party in sort of starting this, joint with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, there's still this sort of chip on the shoulder of the PSDB, this competing party, because they were the ones who came up with it first, right? So in the 2014 election, the challenger, Aécio Neves, wrote a couple op-eds in a major news daily trying to say, no, well, it's us, we did it, we started it, right, in the Folha de São Paulo. And yet, the PT's ability to campaign on the Bolsa Familia and to really ascribe this program to them is quite strong amongst most Brazilians. What's really interesting is that this also happened in Mexico, right? So before the PRI was out of power in 2000, started a very similar program in 1998 called Progressa. Then it was nationalized and beefed up by the incoming party, and some early work of mine has shown that the program, though very different as in its nature and certain nitpicky details, citizens citizens credit the PAN with that party also, or with providing that program also. So it's sort of rebranding has actually played a big part in this.
This may be just another version of Walter's comment,
Okay.
but I'm really interested in this. It's striking that at one level that the 63% of that's sort of the baseline, right? 63% of even the non-beneficiaries are able to correctly attribute the program, and being a beneficiary gives you an 11 percentage point boost in terms of that attribution rate. Do you have anything from your, from the other survey questions you asked that help us sort of get a handle on what predicts attribution rates, other than receiving the program? So where is this coming from? Media exposure or yeah. Mm-hmm.
I do have the indignating question was a big bugaboo, but I think I got around it.
I don't want to hijack.
No, please go ahead. No, the indigeneity of attribution is kind of a very clear thing that on its face sticks out, right? Not only so. On the first question, yes, I looked at a couple different things: interest in politics, where you primarily get your news, TV, radio, friends, etc. And those really didn't correlate in an interesting way. But the hidden patterns here are kind of important, right? So it could be, there's this possible idea that being a supporter of the PT would lead you to attribute the program to the party. But we observe, at least in my study, we're observing this, right? So we should expect similar results for a priori partisans that are beneficiaries or non-beneficiaries. So I split the samples by beneficiary status, and I ran the same regressions on only beneficiaries, and attribution, of course, is the main indicator variable there, or non-beneficiaries, and only beneficiaries have positive results, right? So there's this idea that perhaps in a full sample, like the magnitude or the direction of the result is muddled by being
What is partisanship here?
partisanship?
What is partisanship? Is this the party ID question?
Yeah, who do you sympathize? Do you sympathize with the party? Is it the PT? Right?
Not the voting question.
Not the voting question, right? Because in my mind, at least, if something is guiding your vote that's also guiding attribution, it's going to be partisanship. So, I mean, I could have looked at, 2010 vote recall, but again, there's kind of weird issues with that question, just generally, right? So then I did some post-estimation robustness checks as well, right? So I matched the data. I tried to manipulate treatment by matching on attribution instead of beneficiary status. The results are pretty similar. However, 2 measures of correlation between partisanship and attribution are there, right? So when you look at a binary regression or a Pearson's R, there's a weak correlation between the two. So there's really nothing I can do about that except to say, please be convinced. Yeah, but yes, that's kind of an important question.
Thanks so much, Ellie. I have 2 questions. The first question is sort of about the process of receiving the benefit. So are there people that are eligible that live on the same block that don't receive it, and what are the reasons why they might not receive it? Like, are there, besides the conditions that you talked about, are there other kinds of barriers to them receiving the benefit? And my second question has to do with regionalism in Brazil. So for a long time in Brazil's history, as I'm sure you knew when you picked your sites, there's a lot of questions about the Northeast being kind of like ungovernable or outside of the country. And I'm wondering how this program functions to bring people from the Northeast into a national system. I noticed on the cards it says Brazil. Like, it's clearly a benefit of the national government. So I was wondering how you could talk about how that relates to people's interest in voting beyond the scope of partisanship in some way.
Great. So to receive the program, so it's actually quite technical, but the insulated bureaucracy that was not allowed to talk to partisans in order to keep this program politically neutral, gave municipal social services offices a small amount of money, like R$1 per person that they signed up for the program that was then admitted to the program. That helped because this was creating and nationalizing this program was a monumental bureaucratic undertaking, the likes of which Brazil had never really attempted. Right? So that was one way, right? Was to induce through municipal transfers that getting everyone onto the same page, right? And in some of the cases I talked about out in the countryside near Uberlândia, in some of the more rural districts in cities around it, this was things like we finally had money to copy the papers, right, or to send postage back to the federal government, right? So there's a non-trivial just capacities element to this, and the Ministry of Social Development that is responsible for providing Bolsa Familia has been widely credited worldwide for how they designed a system to really target people and get transfers to the right people. Why would someone not receive the Bolsa if they were eligible? Well, beyond not meeting the means test, which has some interesting ramifications as well, right? Hiding formal labor or not pursuing formal labor so that your paperwork shows that you make no money even if you do make it, right? These are types of complaints that came up on the survey, right? The enumerators would report, people had said, right? So-and-so, Fulano has a TV, and he doesn't have enough money to have a TV, and he still receives the Bolsa, that type of thing. One could go to City Hall and request paperwork, and one could go to a member of the staff of a local council person or something and request that they help him or her. However, that's frowned upon because it could easily become corruption, right? So you really mostly go through the Social Security network. And regionalism, yeah. Part of the effect of this program that's so striking to people who study Brazil is that it's created this sort of reverse regionalism in national elections, right? That areas that were once governed by local bosses are now largely supporters of the PT, at least until 2015. In some cases, I can say that this is the first time people have received a national identity card, right? Through this system of kind of inculcating people into the state, that becomes quite important. I can say that nationally, there is some pushback from the taxpayers, right? So this is sort of like redistribution as taxpayers and recipients. There is some pushback from southeastern taxpayers in big metropolis like Rio and Sao Paulo against the Bolsa Familia, against the Northeast, right? They're taking all of our money and we're just handing it to them, and now we have Dilma again, right? So we kind of get this odd national politic, essentially somewhat similar to the welfare dynamic in the U.S. Hello?
Thanks for the great presentation, Ellie. So my question is also about attribution. That seems to be, I think, also a fascinating thing, right? But it's unclear still where the sources of variation in attribution among beneficiaries are coming from. And that was not the point of your main study. But I'm wondering if in the future you're thinking about exploring that further, because I think that it also has serious implications for policy relevance of the study, right? Like this link, if attribution really is important, holding partisanship constant, and I'd like to hear more about also the endogeneity issue maybe later. Still, where is the variation in attribution coming from? And I'm wondering if maybe doing focus groups and just more qualitative, open-ended interviews might be one way to go about it, because there's so many things that you can control, and maybe there's something more idiosyncratic going on as well in terms of just why some people are more predisposed to attribute than others.
Right. So I've looked at it in as many ways as I could attack the question, right? And looking at different types of information, different types of social networks, et cetera, right? So I can only say that there are a lot of people in our country that know Obamacare is Obama, but don't know that the ACA is Obamacare, right? So there's some, I don't know. It's not correlated with level of schooling. It could simply be an idiosyncratic propensity to figure out facts or to put those things together, right? So what I think is the purchase of something like this is to say that there is a role for understanding who credits, right? And that simply blanketly saying beneficiaries are one group and that it's not actually marginal effects within that large group of people, right? That is sort of the purchase of this design. So we really can't get at that. And yes, I did think of focus groups. I ran out of money and time in each survey site. And it was hard to, so just as selecting respondents was difficult, selecting focus group participants from within that category was more difficult. And finding a neutral place. In each survey site, I was affiliated with a university or a local think tank, and they were kind of hard for people to get to because we're talking about people who live often in the periphery. So the logistics of focus groups were kind of difficult, but that was where I wanted to go. Other focus groups run by other Brazilians about Bolsa Familia have suggested that people are pretty savvy about this stuff. So they don't ask my questions, of course. They're not writing my papers, but thank goodness. But yeah, so yeah.
One last question. Now, please join me in thanking Dr.